What would you do if you found a cursed object in a museum? Think about it. You're there, walking through the silent corridors, observing display cases full of antiques, when suddenly you feel something different. A chill, a feeling that you shouldn't be there. Because the truth is that not everything kept behind glass or locked in a basement is just history. Some things carry much more than dust and memories. In 1987, an ordinary visitor touched a specific object in the basement of a Toronto museum. It was just a forgotten piece, without a label, without official identification. But from that moment on, his life changed completely. He was never the same again. And this is not the only story. Ontario is full of museums that hide dark secrets, objects linked to tragedies, unexplained deaths, and events that most people would prefer to forget. Today, I'm going to tell you the story of 5 cursed objects hidden in Ontario museums that most people should never encounter. Real objects, with disturbing histories, linked to abandoned hospitals, deactivated prisons, and places where suffering has left a permanent mark. Have you ever visited any of these places and felt that something was wrong? Stay with me until the end, because what you're about to discover may completely change the way you see these seemingly harmless spaces. If you come across one of them during a visit, don't touch it, because some objects don't just want to be remembered, they want to be found. And when that happens, the consequences can be terrifying. Before we continue, I need you to do something now. If these forgotten stories and dark places appeal to you, please like and subscribe to the channel, because that's what keeps this content alive and allows us to continue revealing the darkest mysteries of Ontario and Canada. And if you want to go further, with exclusive content, early access, and deeper investigations, join the membership program from the channel. Discover what most will never see. Now let's begin, because the first story is far more disturbing than it seems. Object 5. The surgeon's kit from the old Kingston Penitentiary. There is a place in Ontario where justice has become something far darker than simple punishment. Kingston Penitentiary, permanently closed in 2013, was for over 170 years one of the most feared prisons in Canada. Its walls witnessed violence, extreme isolation, executions, and something far beyond what any prison system should allow. Because within that institution, there was a doctor whose name has been erased from official records, but whose legacy remains alive through an object now kept in the Kingston Museum. We're talking about a complete 19th century surgical kit. It's not just a collection of old instruments. It's a set of tools that was used in brutal procedures performed without anesthesia on prisoners who had no choice, who couldn't refuse, who were simply dragged into a back room of the infirmary and subjected to experiments that defied any medical or ethical code. Rusty scalpels, amputation saws with permanent stains, thick needles that look more like instruments of torture than of healing. All of this is there, displayed in rotating museum showcases, as if they were just harmless historical relics. But the truth is that this kit carries the physical pain of dozens of men who were mutilated in the name of science and institutional control. The doctor responsible for these procedures believed that certain criminal characteristics could be removed through direct surgical interventions. He performed rudimentary lobotomies, unnecessary amputations, experiments with living tissue, all while the prisoners were conscious, tied to wooden tables, screaming until their voices failed. The official records from that time are incomplete, deliberately vague, as if someone had tried to erase these atrocities from the official history of the penitentiary. What makes this object truly disturbing is not just the stories of the past, but the impact it continues to have on people in the present. Visitors to the Kingston Museum who stop before this particular display case report inexplicable physical sensations, sharp pains in the abdomen, as if something were cutting from the inside, stabbing pains in the skull, exactly in the areas where lobotomies were performed, intense burning in the limbs, as if they were being slowly amputated. These are not just psychological impressions or mental suggestions. They are sensations so real and so intense that some people have literally fainted upon touching the glass of the display case. One specific case involves a medical student who visited the museum in 2018. He was researching the history of forensic medicine in Canada and was fascinated by the surgical kit. He spent almost 20 minutes observing each instrument, taking photos, and making notes. Suddenly, he felt a sharp pain in his left leg, so intense that he collapsed. Museum staff rushed to help him. When they lifted the hem of his trousers, they found deep red marks, as if something had pressed against or cut his skin. exactly in the area where lower limb amputations were performed in that penitentiary. He was taken to the hospital. Doctors couldn't explain the marks. There was nothing that could have physically caused them. He hadn't bumped into anything. There was nothing sharp near him. The marks disappeared completely within 48 hours, but the experience scarred him psychologically in a permanent way. He never returned to the museum and abandoned his research on prison medical history. Kingston Museum staff know this display case is problematic. They receive complaints regularly. People who feel unexplained discomfort, visitors who need to leave the room quickly, children who cry for no apparent reason when they pass near the kit. But the museum keeps the object on display because, officially, these are just coincidences or psychosomatic reactions. Behind the scenes, however, night guards avoid that section of the museum. They report hearing metallic sounds, as if instruments were being manipulated inside the sealed display case. Some claim to have seen shadows moving around the exhibit when no one is present. The mentality behind the creation of this kit was one of absolute control, of forced transformation through pain. And perhaps it is precisely this energy that remains imbued in those instruments. Pain doesn't simply disappear because time passes. It accumulates, concentrates, becomes part of the physical matter of the objects that were used to inflict suffering. And when you get too close, when you allow your own energy to come into contact with this concentrated emotional and physical charge, your body reacts, not by suggestion, not by imagination, but because something real is happening there, something that science still cannot fully explain. If you've ever felt unexplained pain in historical places, or if you believe that objects can carry the energy of the events they witnessed, write this down. The pain remains, because now we need to talk about a mirror that reflects much more than just its image. An object that came directly from the execution cell of one of Toronto's most haunted prisons. Object 4, the Crying Doll of Fort York. Fort York, for those unfamiliar, is one of Toronto's most important historical landmarks. It's the place where tourists take photos next to rusty cannons, walk along the ancient walls, and imagine what life was like for British soldiers in the 19th century. But according to rumors unknown to visitors, there's a room in the museum's archives, far from the public eye, where something very disturbing happens every night. Something the staff try to ignore, but can't forget. Kept there, wrapped in fabric yellowed by time and protected inside an unmarked wooden box, is a Victorian doll. She has dark hair made of horsehair, glass eyes that still shine even after almost 200 years, and a white dress stained by something that looks like rust. But it's not rust. The story of this doll is as tragic as it is disturbing, and what happens around her defies any logical explanation. This doll belonged to a little girl of only 6 years old who died during the brutal cholera outbreak that devastated Toronto in 1834. At that time, the city was small, sanitation was poor, and when the epidemic arrived, it was merciless. Entire families were decimated in a matter of days. The disease struck without warning, causing vomiting, severe diarrhea, and extreme dehydration. People simply wasted away before the eyes of those they loved, unable to do anything but watch the suffering. The girl who owned that doll was one of those victims. According to historical records still kept in the Fort York archives, she was found clutching the doll when she died, alone in a secluded room. Because her own parents had also succumbed to the illness days before, the doll was all that remained of her. No living relatives, no identified grave, just that object, a silent witness to a lonely and terrifying death. Now comes the part that transforms this sad story into something truly terrifying. Employees at the Fort York Museum have reported, for decades, hearing cries coming from the storage room where the doll is kept, always at midnight, always for the same duration, about 3 minutes. A muffled, childlike cry, as if coming from very far away or from inside something closed. Some night guards refuse to patrol that specific area of the museum. Others have requested transfers or simply abandoned their jobs without giving detailed explanations. A former employee who worked there for over 15 years revealed in an unofficial interview that one night, driven by curiosity and tired of hearing that sound, he opened the box where the doll was kept. That's when he noticed something impossible. The doll's glass eyes were wet. It wasn't condensation. It wasn't ambient humidity. They were tears. And when he looked closer, he saw that the liquid had a reddish hue, as if it were mixed with blood. He never went back to that room alone again, and he began having recurring nightmares, always the same dreamscape. He was in Toronto during the cholera epidemic. seeing bodies being piled up in the streets, hearing screams of agony, smelling the unbearable stench of death all around him. He would wake up sweating, with the physical sensation of being ill, even though he was perfectly healthy. This lasted for months, until he finally quit his job, and he wasn't the only one. There are at least 4 documented accounts of people who, after looking directly into the eyes of that doll, began to experience vivid nightmares about the epidemic. Nightmares so realistic that they would wake up with physical symptoms: nausea, abdominal pain, extreme weakness. Doctors found nothing wrong, but the symptoms only completely disappeared when these people permanently distanced themselves from the museum. The hidden truth behind this doll is that it carries not only the memory of a dead child, but the emotional weight of a collective tragedy that forever marked Toronto. It has become a receptacle of pain, fear, and abandonment. And perhaps, just perhaps, something of that little girl is still trapped there, unable to move on, eternally reliving her last moments of life. This is the kind of revelation that transforms a simple museum object into something you would never want to encounter in person. If you've ever visited Fort York and felt something strange about the place, or if you know someone who works there and has stories to tell, comment below. I believe you, because this journey through Ontario's cursed objects is just beginning, and the next item on this list will take you inside one of Canada's most brutal and forgotten prisons. Object 3. The mirror from the Old Don Jail. There's something deeply unsettling about looking in a mirror and not recognizing the face staring back at you. I'm not talking about a subtle change or a trick of the light. I'm talking about seeing a completely different person staring back at you from the other side of the glass, with eyes full of terror, despair, and the unwavering certainty that death is approaching. Legend has it that this is exactly what happens to anyone who finds a specific mirror kept in the basement of the Todmorden Mills Heritage Museum in Toronto, a mirror that came directly from the execution cell of the Old Don Jail, the prison that operated from 1864 to 1977, and which witnessed some of the most controversial executions in Canadian history. Don Jail was known for its inhumane conditions: extreme overcrowding, intense cold in winter, suffocating heat in summer, constant violence between prisoners, and a punishment system that included prolonged isolation in tiny cells where sunlight never entered. But what made that place truly terrifying was the execution wing. There, those condemned to death spent their last days knowing exactly when and how they would die, and in the cell where they awaited their final execution, hanging on the damp stone wall, was an ornate mirror with a dark hand-carved wooden frame. This mirror was the last object the condemned saw before being led to the gallows. They looked at themselves, at the reflection of a man who in a few hours would cease to exist. Some wept before it, others screamed, broke things, begged for mercy that would never come. There were those who simply stood paralyzed, staring at their own faces, trying to memorize who they were before it all ended. This mirror absorbed each of those final moments of lucidity, fear, and forced acceptance of imminent death. When Don Jail finally closed its doors, most of the objects were discarded or sold, but that particular mirror ended up in the hands of a private collector who eventually donated it to the Todmorden Mills Heritage Museum. It has never been put on public display. It is stored in the basement, in a restricted storage area where only employees have access. And there's a good reason for that, because the people who look into that mirror don't see themselves. They see the faces of the men who were executed in that prison. A museum employee who had worked there for over 10 years recounted her experience in an informal interview. She was organizing items in the basement when she found the mirror covered by a thick cloth. Curious, she removed the cloth and looked at her reflection. For a moment, she saw her own face normally, but then, as if someone had quickly altered a photograph, the reflection transformed. It was a middle-aged man with a scruffy beard, sunken eyes, and an expression of utter terror. He was crying. She could see the tears streaming down his face, and then he began to move his lips, as if pleading, but no sound came out. She dropped the mirror on the floor and ran out of the basement. It took her weeks to get back to that area, and when she finally returned, she covered the mirror again and asked that no one else touch it. But human curiosity is inevitable. Other employees over the years discovered the mirror and had similar experiences. Different faces, always men, always terrified, always silent, but clearly trying to communicate something urgent, something desperate. The psychological impact of these experiences is profound. One person reported that after seeing a stranger's face in a mirror, she began having vivid flashbacks of memories that weren't her own. Memories of being trapped in a dark cell, of hearing approaching footsteps, of feeling the rough rope around her neck. She had never been imprisoned. She had never visited Don Jail when it was still in operation. But the memories were so real, so detailed, that she needed to seek therapeutic help to cope with the trauma of memories that didn't belong to her. The hidden truth behind that mirror is that it has become an emotional portal. It doesn't reflect light. It reflects the last intense human emotions poured into it by men who knew they were going to die. Pure fear, devastating regret, hopeless despair. And when you look into it, your own identity temporarily dissolves, replaced by the fragmented identities of those who never managed to move on. They remained trapped there, in that reflection, eternally reliving their last moments of consciousness before the fatal fall through the trapdoor of the gallows. Occasional visitors who manage to gain access to the museum's basement, either through special tours or inside connections, sometimes stumble upon this mirror by accident. The reaction is always visceral. Some run away immediately. Others are paralyzed, unable to look away, hypnotized by the face that is not their own but somehow feels familiar, as if they were looking at an alternate version of themselves in unimaginable circumstances. Guards on night patrol avoid that section of the basement altogether. They report hearing whispers coming from where the mirror is kept, overlapping male voices, all speaking at once, all pleading for something that can never be granted. If you believe that objects can capture and store extreme emotional energy, or if you've ever had an inexplicable experience with old mirrors, comment below. I saw something, because now we're going to delve into an even more disturbing collection. Objects literally made from parts of dead people, created in a mourning ritual that straddles the line between memory and obsession. Object 2. The mourning ring collection, jewelry made from the hair of the dead. What would you do if you could carry a physical part of someone you love after that person dies? I'm not talking about photographs or personal objects. I'm literally talking about a part of that person's body, preserved and transformed into jewelry, something you could wear on your finger, neck, or wrist, maintaining that physical connection even after death. It seems macabre by today's standards, but during the Victorian era, this practice was not only common but considered one of the most profound ways to demonstrate love and respect for the dead. These were called mourning jewels, and the most popular of them were rings made from braided human hair, preserved inside glass or metal compartments. The Museum of Ontario Archaeology houses a unique collection of mourning rings that goes far beyond a simple cultural tradition. Stories circulate that this collection belonged to a single family completely devastated by diphtheria in 1856. In just 2 weeks, this family lost 7 children. 7. Imagine the psychological transformation the parents underwent. Imagine waking up every day knowing that another child might not survive until nightfall. Diphtheria was brutal back then. It caused extremely high fevers, severe throat inflammation that slowly suffocated children, and there was no effective treatment available. Parents could only watch helplessly as their children died, one after another. The mother, consumed by grief that surpassed all limits of sanity, decided to create a ring for each dead child. She personally cut each child's hair immediately after death, before the bodies had completely cooled. She braided each strand with her own hands, weeping over the work for days on end. She commissioned 7 identical rings in tarnished silver, each containing a portion of the braided hair of one of the children, and she wore them all at once, all 7 rings on her fingers, as if she were physically carrying the weight of all those lost lives. According to historical accounts, preserved in letters from that time, the mother never recovered. She refused to remove her rings. She slept with them, ate with them, pressed them against her chest during crying fits that lasted for hours. Neighbors reported hearing her talking to herself at night, as if she was speaking to the children, as if they were still alive around her. She died less than a year later, at the age of 32, officially from typhoid fever. But everyone who knew her knew that she had died of pure heartbreak, of a sadness so profound that it consumed her will to live. The rings were preserved and eventually donated to the Museum of Ontario Archaeology, where they remain to this day in a specific display case in the social history wing. And it is there that things get truly disturbing, because these rings are not just historical relics. They carry such an intense, concentrated emotional charge that it physically affects people who pass near them, especially at night when the museum is empty and silent. Night guards patrolling that section of the museum report consistent and terrifying experiences. They feel a sudden weight on their chest, as if someone was sitting on them, forcing the air out of their lungs. difficulty breathing that arises out of nowhere without any apparent medical cause. And along with these physical sensations comes an inexplicable, overwhelming sadness that leaves them on the verge of tears for no rational reason. It's as if the pain of that Victorian mother is still imbued in the rings, radiating to anyone who gets too close. A guard who had worked there for almost 20 years shared his experience in an informal conversation. He said that one night, while passing by the display case of mourning rings, he felt something so intense that he had to lean against the wall to avoid falling. It wasn't just sadness, it was the visceral sensation of multiple losses, of seeing everything you love being ripped away from you repeatedly, without pause, without mercy. He began to cry right there, in the middle of the dark museum corridor, unable to stop. It took him almost 15 minutes to regain enough emotional control to continue his rounds. He never again passed through that section alone at night. What makes this collection especially impactful is the direct emotional connection it establishes. It's not an abstract story of past suffering. It's real suffering, crystallized in physical objects you can see, right there in front of you, literally containing parts of the dead children. Human hair doesn't decompose easily. Those strands braided inside the rings are the same ones that were on those children's heads more than 150 years ago. They are a material bridge between life and death, between present and past, between who we are now and who those people were in their final moments. The Victorian mindset regarding death was completely different from ours. They didn't hide death. They didn't treat it as taboo. They integrated it into daily life through elaborate mourning rituals that could last for years. But this particular family crossed the line between healthy grief and destructive obsession. The mother wasn't just honoring her dead children. She was clinging to them, refusing to let them go, transforming her love into an emotional prison that eventually killed her. And that energy, that refusal to accept death, that pain transformed into something toxic, remains alive in the rings. Occasional museum visitors who stop before this display case often feel something strange, even during the day. A sudden melancholy, an inexplicable urge to cry. Some describe the feeling of being watched by someone small, the size of a child. And there are reports of people who, after seeing the rings, began to have recurring dreams of Victorian children crying, asking to be remembered, begging not to be forgotten. If you've ever felt sudden and inexplicable sadness in historical places, or if you believe that objects can absorb and transmit intense human emotions, write this down. The grief remains, because there's only one more object missing from this list, and perhaps the most disturbing of all. A book containing the names of people who should never have been forgotten, and some claim to have seen their own names written on pages that should have been closed decades ago. Object 1. The Ledger from the Asylum, the book that records lost souls. Let's talk about destiny. Do you believe that certain things are already written? That some truths about our future already exist somewhere, just waiting to be discovered? Because there's a book kept in some museum in Toronto, whose exact location isn't publicly disclosed, that contains something far more disturbing than just historical records. It's the admissions and treatment book of the former Asylum for the Insane in Toronto, the psychiatric institution that operated from the late 19th to the mid-20th century, and which we now know as part of the CAMH complex. They say this book meticulously documents every patient who passed through those doors, every absurd diagnosis given to people who often had no real mental illness, and every brutal treatment applied in the name of a cure. The pages of this book are yellowed, stained by dampness and time, handwritten in tight, hard-to-decipher handwriting. But what is written there is absolutely terrifying. Descriptions of lobotomies performed without proper anesthesia, using improvised instruments that looked more like carpentry tools than medical equipment. Accounts of prolonged ice baths used as punishment for patients who refused to obey, leaving people submerged in ice water for hours until they lost consciousness. Notes on extreme isolation in windowless cells, where patients were kept in absolute darkness for weeks, months, until any trace of sanity they still possessed was completely destroyed. The doctors who ran that place operated under a mentality that viewed any deviation from socially acceptable behavior as an illness to be eradicated. Women who defied their husbands were diagnosed with hysteria and forcibly institutionalized. Men who showed emotions were considered mentally weak and subjected to shock treatments. Children who were simply different, who did not fit the rigid standards of the time, were labeled as disabled and locked up there for the rest of their lives. The book records all of this with a clinical coldness that makes reading it absolutely nauseating. But the truly terrifying part of this book isn't just the historical horrors it documents, it's what happens to the people who find it and decide to leaf through it. There's a persistent rumor, shared in whispers among museum staff and collectors of historical artifacts, that if you read your own name in that book, you're destined to repeat the fate of the patients whose names were recorded there. And yes, I know how absurd that sounds. Technically, it's impossible. That book contains records of people who lived and died decades, even more than a century ago. The admission date was 1893, more than 100 years before she was born. The listed diagnosis was chronic melancholia with obsessive tendencies. She took a picture of the page and immediately left the place. She tried to rationalize. It must have been a coincidence. There must have been someone with the same name decades ago. But the physical description noted next to the name matched hers perfectly. No one knows exactly where she is now or what her mental state is. But the names of 3 members of his immediate family in the book, all listed as admitted patients on different dates over decades. Attempts to locate him failed. There are no records of banking activity, use of documents, nothing. It's as if he simply ceased to exist. Now, let us think about the psychological impact of seeing your own name in a book that documents inhumane treatments applied to people considered insane. Even if you try to rationalize, even if you know it's technically impossible, the seed of doubt has already been planted. You begin to question your own sanity. You start observing your own thoughts and behaviors with paranoia. Every intense emotion, every impulsive decision, every moment of sadness or anxiety becomes evidence that perhaps you are destined to follow the same path as those patients documented. It's a self-fulfilling curse, fueled by the power of suggestion and the overwhelming weight of the history that book carries. The hidden truth here is that perhaps the book doesn't show the future. Perhaps it simply reveals a connection that already existed, an invisible line linking the suffering of the past to the suffering of the present. Undiagnosed mental illnesses, untreated traumas, social pressures that destroy people from the inside out. All of this existed in the past and continues to exist now. Seeing your name in that book may simply be a brutal revelation that you share the same kind of vulnerability those people had, the same capacity to be broken by circumstances beyond your control. If you believe that some objects can reveal truths we'd rather not know, or if you've ever had the feeling of being destined to repeat patterns from the past, comment below. My name is written, because now is the time to tie all these stories together and understand what's really happening with these cursed objects scattered throughout Ontario's museums. So, after everything we've seen here, the question you might be asking yourself now is, are these objects truly cursed, or do they simply carry the weight of the tragedies they witnessed? Perhaps the answer lies somewhere between these two possibilities. Perhaps the true curse isn't in the objects themselves, but in our tendency to forget the stories of past suffering, to ignore that each ancient object was touched by real hands, seen by real eyes, and witnessed moments that forever marked lives. When we lock these memories away in museum display cases and basements, when we stop recognizing the humanity behind each artifact, perhaps that's when we create the true weight these objects carry. But there's something you need to know. Something that makes this journey even more mysterious. All 5 of these objects I revealed today have one thing in common. No museum officially admits to having them. No identification plaque. No publicly accessible record. No official confirmation that they exist exactly where I said they are. This knowledge is shared behind the scenes, among employees, collectors, and researchers who have had access to restricted areas. If you actually go looking for them, if you manage to find them during a visit, it might be best not to tell anyone. Because some discoveries carry consequences that go beyond what we can rationally understand. And you, have you ever visited any of these museums in Ontario? Have you ever felt something strange in some historical place that you couldn't explain? If you know other stories of cursed objects hidden in Canada, or if you've ever had inexplicable experiences in abandoned places, leave them in the comments. I read everything, and many of these stories become the next videos. If you've made it this far with me on this journey through Ontario's darkest mysteries, right, I'm with you until the end. This shows me that there are people who really connect with this type of content, who don't just want superficial entertainment, but real stories that make you think and feel something real. If this video touched you in any way, if you felt that shiver, that connection with these forgotten stories, leave a like here. This helps more people find this content and keep alive these memories that deserve to be remembered. And subscribe to the channel, because every week I bring explorations of the most haunted, abandoned, and fascinating places in Canada. Places that most people pass right by without realizing the depth of the stories they hold. There's a video here that complements this topic, talking about abandoned psychiatric hospitals in Ontario and what really happened within those walls. Click and continue with me there, because this journey is only beginning. And remember, not everything kept in a museum should be found. Until next time, if you dare.